Okay, everybody, welcome back to the Pat Flynn Show. We're going to talk about the philosophical case for Christianity. I am joined by Classical Theist. I'm going to just use CT for short. CT, this is your second time on the show, but the first episode actually hasn't been released yet, so this might be the first time anybody has seen you on the show. So welcome, my friend, and glad to have you here.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Last time I think we discussed sexual morality
That's right.
and its relationship to sort of a perennial philosophy, I guess. Um, I don't know when you're going to release that, but yeah, it's just good to be on with you again.
Yeah, so I want to do a fair amount of stage setting here before we dive into it. I think this is going to be a really cool topic, and I think it'll hopefully help people sort of expand the way they think about the sort of bridge from classical theism to Christianity. But from what I remember, CT, I think I mentioned in passing to Gavin in one of our previous live streams or podcasts that these types of philosophical considerations of specifically surrounding the nature of God and the good being naturally self-diffusive and self-communicative lends a really strong plausibility or even a certain sort of degree of prediction expectation to something like the incarnation. Now, maybe we wouldn't be able to like predict it exactly, but it's a broad expectation and it fits really well. And then the fact that it seems like this actually has happened, or that we have some historical evidence for something like this, it does a lot of work. And at least for me, it was really appealing. And then we started chatting about that, and I'm like, let's just do it. Let's jam on that. I'm like, yes, let's jam on that. So here we are about to jam on it. So any opening remarks or just things you want people to keep in mind before we start getting into the weeds and some of this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very important to lay out from the onset that this is a philosophical case. And the reason why I think that's important is not to dismiss or to lessen the importance of establishing like the historicity of the resurrection, for example, or the historicity of the empty tomb, or the historicity of the martyrdom of the early disciples of Christ. That is I think it's necessary. I think it's very, very, very key and important in this day and age, especially for people who are not as inclined to delve into the weeds of philosophical abstractions like we're going to be doing.
Right.
But I do think it's also equally, if not more important, to sort of establish a natural route, a natural pathway from classical theism, which is growing, I think, in importance, in prevalence, and I think the public consciousness among people who are philosophically inclined, drawing a clear and natural route from that to Christianity, not in the same way. So like we're not going to be arguing that the incarnation, for example, can be proved in just the same way that the existence and nature and attributes of God can be proved. That's not going to be my claim. I don't think that's your claim. But it's also important to recognize that deductive proof is by no means the only thing necessary for demanding the assent of the mind to something. There are a whole host of things that strong plausibility is sufficient for demanding the assent of the mind to that truth. And I think that's what this philosophical case for the incarnation in particular, I think that's it. That's what that establishes. It's going to establish, if it's successful, if the arguments work, it's going to establish a basis for very, I think, strong plausibility of hypothetical expectation. And what it can do, in my opinion, is it can lessen the epistemic burden.
That it shares in doing the work. Right.
That the historical arguments have. Right. So in a way, what I guess I could put it this way: you have sort of a symbiotic relationship between the historical arguments and the philosophical arguments. The philosophical arguments may be coming from above, coming down from above, and the historical arguments coming from, the empirical, from the
Yeah.
facts on the ground, from the ground up, coming together, and establishing a case that I think is I would use the phrase
Mhm.
rationally unavoidable.
Yeah, yeah, okay, that's good. So let me give a kind of a crude example of what you're talking about, because I think this is
Yeah,
really
absolutely.
important. And so like, say that there's some sort of evidence that some dude John committed a crime, right? And it, okay, maybe it's not like absolutely 100% compelling that John committed it. But if you have prior reasons to think that John would commit a crime like this, so say that he's got a felony record, right? And John's character, and he's even said in some sense that I think I'm going to go rob this store at a particular time. And then it just happens that you have evidence that fits with those prior expectations, right? You can see how it sort of lessens the burden that the specific on the scene evidence needs to play in order for you to, rationally say, yeah, no, this was John. This is John that did it, right? Those prior expectations, those prior reasons. I like the way you put it, sort of share the epistemic burden for people who are trying to evaluate the truth of Christianity. Now, just kind of replace those prior expectations in that crude example I gave with just sort of deep metaphysical considerations about the existence of God, the nature of God, what the good is. The good is naturally self-diffusive, self-communicative. Staple that with some pretty obvious and undeniable facts of existence, like things seem to have gone wrong on some level, right? Right. And then, might it make sense that we might have something like, I don't want to spoil it. I don't want to get into it first, because
Yeah,
we'll get
right.
into the reads there. But I'm just
uh,
trying to do the stage setting and help people get their expectations right for what we're
yes,
about to do. You see what I'm saying?
I think the core case analogy is very good,
Mhm.
and what it can do, I think, is it can lead one to the conclusion that it would be very weird. It would be very unbefitting. It would be uh, contrary to our rational expectations if something like the incarnation did not happen. So, and it'll also, I think, bleed into discussions about the Trinity, and of course original sin as well.
Mhm.
But that'll all, I think, make sense and
Yeah.
tie in when we kind of unpack this a bit.
Good. So I'll let you start out here in just a minute. I just want to say one other thing about sort of arguments and worldview comparisons, and what we're going to be, I guess, making a case for is a sort of degree of coherence or elegance. And this is something that often goes into sort of large view competing theories, comparisons of large view competing theories, right? It's like when we're comparing and contrasting different worldviews. Typically, the way that this proceeds is in order to sort of like take another worldview down or to sort of lessen its plausibility or probability. You try to argue that it has various degrees of coherence problems or incoherence, right? Now, the worst being a contradiction, right? If we've got a contradiction in a particular position,
Right.
that's like a death blow, right? But for the most part, it's just arguing different degrees of incoherence, and it comes in degrees, right? And we're kind of going to be doing the reverse here. We're going to be saying Christianity coheres extremely well. And coherence, when I talk about coherence, I just like mean broadly, we can kind of, when something has a high degree of coherence, we say we can see how things fit together really nicely, and that's typically
Yes.
preferred. So that's the kind of final stage setting remark that I want to say is like what this case is a case for a great befittingness and a really nice gelling, if you will, coherence between classical theism and Christianity, which makes it very favorable, very rationally plausible. Would you add anything to that? Adjust it in any way?
No, I think what you said is absolutely perfect. And
Mhm.
I think if we're going to begin here, it's important to lay down a few things that I think are probably pretty well known by most of your audience, but I think it's just important to sort of reiterate them. And that would be some key distinctive characteristics of classical theism that are necessary to keep at the forefront of our minds in order to go ahead and really make this argument. And so we're not really going to waste much time here arguing for the existence of God, for example. Uh, there are dozens of videos that you've done on this topic, videos that I've done on this topic.
Mhm.
Gavin Kerr, I think Gavin Kerr has done the best job in really laying that case for God's existence.
Mm-hmm.
So, this discussion here is going to presuppose the existence of God, and I think that's okay to do for our purposes of brevity, etc. So if you're unsure on that, you can pause this, watch it later, go to get into Gavin's stuff, get into Pat's stuff. There's so much on that topic already, but if we can establish classical theism, there are a couple distinctive characteristics of it that are very important to keep in mind. One of them would be the divine simplicity, of course, that God is composed of no parts, physical or metaphysical, and that each divine attribute signifies the entirety of the divine essence, signifies all that God is. In a perfectly unified way. So his justice, his mercy, his goodness, which goodness, a very important attribute that we're going to be discussing. They're not synonymous with each other, but they all each signify in their own way the entirety of the divine substance, such that no attribute gets at something about God that can be disentangled from the entirety of who he is.
Right.
So I think that's important. Secondly, God is infinite. And this follows from classical theism, because if we understand that God is pure being itself, the pure subsistent act of existence itself, we understand that there can be no limitation on the divine, because if there's a limitation on the divine, then he can't be the pure subsisting act of existence itself, because he would be delimited by some particular mode of existence, some particular mode of actuality, which would therefore enter into the divine potency. Because as we know from Thomistic metaphysics, not just Thomistic metaphysics, mind you, but just scholastic metaphysics generally, actuality is only limited by potency. So if you take potency out of the equation, which you have to do in order to assent to God as pure actuality, then God has to be infinite. He has to be completely without any sort of limitations whatsoever.
Right. No boundaries, no restrictions. Yeah.
Right, exactly. The third thing would be that God is goodness itself. God is not only being itself, he is also goodness itself. So maybe we can talk a little bit right now about what we really mean by goodness, because this is
we should.
crucial,
This is a big
critical to
one.
the argument. This is the heart of it, really. So I don't know if you want to give any preliminary remarks about that, then I could bounce off of that, or I could go first.
Yeah, let me just say some preliminary remarks about your preliminary remarks. What we're doing here is we're trying to, arguments are always aimed at a particular audience, right? And a good argument is one where there's a tension proposed, for the audience members, and it's a good argument if they could resolve that tension by rationally accepting the conclusion. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be putting out various commitments that certainly I think philosophical theists should find very attractive, or might otherwise already be committed to, and showing how these give a really strong anticipation or expectation of really the core doctrine of Christianity, which is the incarnation, right? So I emphasize that again, because you can't and shouldn't be expected to prove absolutely every single thing in every single podcast, right? So we're coming in here with various assumptions, but the convertibility principle of goodness and being is going to be one of the kind of critical hinge points here that we're going to focus on. So I think it is worth spending a little bit of time talking about what this principle is, why do we believe it, and then what are its implications. So yeah, back to you then on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So this convertibility principle, what is it really saying? It's saying that being, and what do we mean by being? Like that which is real, that which bears the character of actuality, that which is that which is, right? Full stop. We're saying that this phenomenon of being is in reality identical to what we mean by the good,
Mhm.
or goodness itself. So, to give sort of a broad Aristotelian definition of goodness, we have, from Aristotle himself, that which all things desire. Or to put it in more broad metaphysical terms, that which a thing is inclined toward as uh, that which a thing is inclined toward for its own perfection. Because I don't think there's really a definition of goodness in the world that doesn't have something to do with perfection, right?
Right. Mhm.
And so, what do we mean by? So then we have to ask the question: well, what is perfection? If goodness is that which a thing is inclined toward for its perfection, can we define perfection without being, without actuality?
Mm.
And I think that our contention is going to be no. Perfection is determined precisely by the degree to which a thing conforms to what it is by virtue of its actuality.
Right.
Um, uh, and we can use all sorts of examples to establish that. How do we know that a heart functions in a good or bad way? Well, we know this by discerning, well, what is a heart? What are the what is the functionality that flows from its very nature as a heart, for example?
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and an unhealthy heart is one that performs in such a way that frustrates or does not fully perform according to the demands of its nature, of
Mhm.
of its of its uh, of its actuality. Uh, and, you can apply the same thing to really anything. A classic one is to use geometrical figures, right? Um, uh, a badly drawn triangle is one that, insofar as it is bad, does not conform to its geometrical definition as determined by that that actuality of what the triangle is. Now, if you want to talk about natural substances, you could talk about form and matter, right? Um, a a good natural substance is going to be good in the measure that it conforms to uh, uh, the demands of its nature, which
Right.
is determined by the form it receives,
Mhm.
the substantial form of the thing. So, in every one of these instances, perfection is always uh, tethered to the degree to which a thing is more or less actual,
Right.
right?
It's never anything over and above its being, right? And I think this is gonna be, critical. So I think those were some good, really good examples, CT. I appreciate that. And I see some comments and questions coming in here, so we can even be more, um here's a way I would put some of this, right, for people who are concerned about the convertibility, thesis, right? So we would say that some X is a good K, just a type of kind, right? When we say X is a good K, that implies that X has features relevant for being a member of K to such and such a degree, right? Which is really just a fancier way of saying what you were already saying there, right? In which case, being a good K is nothing over and above having the relevant features to such and such a degree, right? In which case, being a good K just is being a K with relevant features. Call those F, G, and H, whatever they are, right? In which case, being and goodness are identical when considering a good K. And we can go even further because in say for all X, right, whatever that is, if X exists, there's some sort of primary kind K such that X is a member of K and X would not exist if X were not a member of K.
Right.
Right? Just trying to think through this, right? Then what that means, here's the critical point, right? That means at the first moment of X's existence, X has the features relevant for being a member of K, in which
Yes.
case at stage one, X is a good K, hence X is existing as good, in which case being and goodness are identical. So
Yes.
there's a quick
And
sketch
I
for
think
people who want to be, yeah.
I think it's important to sort of broaden our scope of what is entailed by being or existence, because um, a lot of people, when they think of the concept of existence or the concept of being, well, they really just think of efficient causality, right? That which inaugurates the coming into reality of a thing, and really nothing more. But I think St. Thomas's insight is to see goodness through the lens of final causality,
Yeah.
in particular, such that a thing's coming into existence is always ordered toward fulfillment of that thing's very act of existence itself.
Right. Right. Right.
And it's in that fulfillment that a thing becomes much more conformed, all the more richly, to its actuality.
Mm-hmm.
So it ultimately it hinges back on actuality. It hinges back on a thing being more or less actual according to its nature. So a thing comes into existence, a thing receives its act of existence, but that initial reception of that act of existence is not the be all and end all of the act of existence in the
Mm-hmm.
Thomistic scheme. The act of existence, in a way, is a vocation, a calling toward uh, a, a, uh, a fuller and more complete a participation
Yes.
in that act of existence, and it's in that participation which is what we would call being ordered toward the final cause, the purpose for which the thing exists in the first place, which is ultimately prior to that initial coming into existence. The thing comes into existence so that it will uh, conform fully to its it, its perfective actuality, right?
Right, right. And so I also want to emphasize, right, that just in the sense that we have restricted actualities, and say the de ante argument gets us to the unrestricted, non-contingent absolute, the pure act of existence existing through itself, right? That unrestrictedness of being is going to carry over to the unrestrictedness of goodness and perfection as well,
Right.
right?
So maybe
And
just give some. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
yeah, no, I was just going to say, we have to keep the tool of analogy firmly in hand when we're doing this, right? Because just as being comes in many ways, goodness comes in many
Yes.
ways as well, right? So that's why I wanted to emphasize the language of relevant features, right? So God is unrestrictedly supremely good, but his mode of goodness very different than our mode of goodness, right? Because one thing, we're only good by participation. God is good per se in an unrestricted way too. So
Right.
there's so much confusion these days, and I think about classical theism, and so much of it comes from forgetting to keep that tool of analogy in hand when we're doing this type of
Absolutely.
reasoning. So
I
yeah,
think it might
go
be
ahead.
important to maybe give some concrete illustrations, some concrete examples to maybe help keep these principles in mind going forward, so that they're not remaining thoroughly abstract and difficult to read. So maybe we could use just an example of a tree or something, where the tree comes into existence, right? And that initial coming into existence uh, orders the tree toward fulfilling the demands of its nature all the more fully and all the more richly, such as, blossoming forth, growth, uh, ultimately setting the stage for reproducing other trees, right? Um, these features flow from the initial reception of the act of existence.
Hmm.
The act of existence flows down through the form of the tree, the form being that which uh, determines the definition and identity of what the tree is, and then down through the matter, right? The uh, individuated uh, uh, particular substratum, as it were,
Hmm.
which accounts for the individuation of many different trees, right? And the tree is good or bad to the degree that it conforms to that that actualizing principle of its own form.
Hmm.
and that actualizing principle of its own form is brought to actuality by the act of existence. So it's important to keep in mind the hierarchy here, right? We have matter, form, and above both of these, you have the act of existence.
Right.
And so it's the act of existence, which is the fullness, the full richness of actuality in St. Thomas. And the ultimate takeaway here is that goodness is determined by the degree to which a thing participates in its actuality, all throughout these hierarchical levels of being in a thing. So I think that's just I don't know if you want to maybe explain that in maybe better terms, but just so that's a bit clear.
Right. No, I think this is good. I mean, we could do a whole episode on the convertibility principle and principle of analogy. But again, like to get to the heart of the argument, we're just going to have to just say, go watch and read our material on that stuff elsewhere. But if you find this, if this is already a commitment of yours, or if you find this plausible, this general scholastic sort of metaphysical system in conjunction with classical theism, then it's gonna do a lot of work in moving us towards Christianity in a very rational way. So I'm fine with that as a sort of initial preliminary sketch. There was one other thing. There was one other thing I wanted to say about goodness, but it now flew out of my mind. If it comes back to me, I'll bring it up later. But let's proceed.
Yeah, please do if it comes back. So keeping all of this in mind, I think there are two ways that we can proceed to discuss this principle of the good as self-diffusive. This is a term that we're going to have to nail down and define right away. So, keeping in mind what goodness is as we've defined it, and keeping in mind that classical theism commits us to understanding God as the very essence of goodness itself. So keeping those in mind, because if we're going to be arguing for the incarnation, we have to derive this from what we know about God. And what we know about God is derived from what we know about these participated perfections in the world, such as goodness. So just keeping that in mind, there are two ways that I think we can proceed once we sort of get into the concept of the self-diffusiveness of the good. I think we can just speak strictly from what we know about God to even inform us about the good, or we can take from what we know about the good and use that to inform us about what we know about God. So I can explain that a bit more, but maybe we can just talk right now about what the self-diffusiveness of the good is.
Yeah, groovy. Let's do it.
So when we use this term self-diffusive, what are we really saying? What does that really mean? Well, to diffuse is sort of means to spread out, right? To expand. Now that I almost don't like this term to be used to define the concept that we're going to be talking about, because you almost get the impression that what we mean is just like an irrational spraying out of of something, which is not what we're talking about. But a better term I like to use would be maybe the self-communicative nature of the good, or or that the good is self-outpouring.
Self-communicative. It's tough to say. It's a tongue twister, but that's the way Norris Clark positions it, and I think that is better. Yeah.
Yeah. So like when people think self-diffusive, that they think what kind of bizarro terminology are we really using here? But just to think of, maybe we'll just use the term self-communicative or self-outpouring.
Right.
I think those are good terms to use going forward. So why do we say that the good is self-communicative? Now, when we say self-communicative, I think people therefore can already anticipate how this might relate to the incarnation. When we say that the good is self-communicative or self-diffusive, particularly in St. Thomas, I think we have to say two things. One, that the good tends to manifest itself, and also that the good tends to draw others toward union with itself. So we want to focus on manifestation and union.
In union, right.
This is very Dionysian when we talk about manifestation and union. Now, I know that Dionysius has a different conception of the good than St. Thomas does. For more on that, just watch the video I just recently did, just comparing and contrasting the two. I think you'll find that St. Thomas's picture of the good as the fullness of actuality, as opposed to being beyond being, which is Dionysius's view,
Right.
or pseudo-Dionysius, I should say. I think I make the case for how that better complements what Dionysius is aiming for, but I just got to put that out there because we'll get people in the comments saying he's saying he's Dionysian, but he's not really because he's following St. Thomas, and
Right.
you just got to cover your bases.
Yeah.
But anyway, so yeah. When we say that the good is self-communicative, why do we say this? Well, like I said, I think we can establish this toward two routes. We can establish this by focusing on what we know about God, or from what we know about actuality in the created world. So maybe we could start with the created world. Starting with manifestation. How do we know that actuality tends to manifest itself, I guess, is what we could say. Well, we've already established that or at least we should know from metaphysical commitments, that a thing that is in actuality only acts insofar as it is in act, right? Because actuality is always antecedent to potentiality. In other words, something has actuality, or rather, I should say, potentiality cannot be reduced to actuality unless actuality is prior to that potentiality. I think that's pretty understandable. So what does that mean? That means that potentiality is only reduced to a state of actuality by conforming itself to that actuality. So what does that mean? That means that actuality has a tendency to produce its own like, that something in potency might receive that actuality and become actual itself, right? We can use a whole host of natural examples to explain this principle. Think of the light of the sun. What does the light of the sun do? What does the actuality of the light of the sun tend to do? Well, it tends to produce its own like. It tends to produce similitudes of itself. Shades of light, rays of light, I should say. Illumination. The sun tends toward illumination. And illumination is a similitude. It's a manifestation of that light. Similarly, we could discuss, like I said, we can go back to vegetation. The tree produces its own like through the acorn, right? It's actualizing power tends to produce its own likeness, and that is because actuality can only come from actuality, and things that are actual have a tendency to produce that which is like itself. So that's manifestation. Is there anything that you might want to add to that, and any additional comments?
No, I think it's just those are good. I mean, some of these examples are so obvious and everyday. People might be wondering, well, why are you even bothering stating them? But it'll tie in eventually. So just be patient with us. There's payoff to some
Right.
what might seem like trivialities at this point. And yeah, I mean, there's also just is the interesting reflection that Norris Clark invites, that to think of something being actual but not present. Like, it doesn't even make sense, right?
Yeah, I remember saying that.
Yeah, how could some, like, just meditate on that it's something that's actual but is in no way present, in reality in any sense. It just seems fundamentally absurd. So, like, that's what an act of existence is that which distinguishes something from nothing, makes it actively present in reality, and able to be in relation in community with all other real beings. And a lot of kind of what we're going to be drawing on here, already are drawing on, are insights from one of my favorite schools, which are Thomistic personalists, right? And what personalists do, or what they've done, is they've Clark is pretty big on this. He says the seeds are all there in St. Thomas, but they weren't developed in St. Thomas, right? The seeds to see the inner relationality of being. To be is to be
Yes.
substance in relation, right? And even being in its most unrestricted form, being inherently personal, right? Which, obviously is we're talking about the Trinity there at the
Very
end of the
evocative
day,
of the
right?
Trinity, yes.
Yeah, very evocative of the Trinity. So there's just these great sort of metaphysical insights that you are not going to find all of these directly in St. Thomas. I just want to be clear about that. But if you follow in the tradition, especially the Thomistic personalists, that's where you're going to get a lot of, I think, this really rich development and deeper reflection on just the very nature of being, and the inherent relationality, not just the goodness is a big part, but the relationality, and even being as personal when it's most fully being, right? Being most fully is fully personal is another
Right.
big theme of Father Norris Clark. So I just wanted to add those considerations in just to kind of supplement what you're saying. But yeah, please continue on.
Yeah, I think that's great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So just maybe to give one last sort of metaphysical illustration of to establish this principle of the good as self-manifesting. To think of the relationship between form and matter
Mm-hmm.
in our hylomorphic scheme, right? The form, in bestowing its perfective actuality to matter, what does that do to matter? Well, it makes matter more like form,
Mm-hmm.
right? The matter is configured in such a way that manifests the reality of the form that it receives. I think that's maybe the most direct demonstrative way to establish this principle through metaphysics, right? What and think of how the form is a limitation of that act of existence. So the form manifests the limited act of existence of that thing, but I think it's most visibly expressed through matter's relationship to form, right?
Right.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
you know, for example, in humanity, we're going to talk a lot about humanity and the importance of humanity, of what human nature entails, as and how that establishes plausibility for the incarnation. But how the form of humanity is rational animality, and the matter reflects that. It manifests the reality of what rational animality is, right? The human body is designed in such a way that reflects this principle of an animal that is rational, an animal that thinks, right?
Right.
So I think that's pretty sufficient for how the good tends toward self-manifestation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what about union? That's the other important dimension to this. That the good is self-manifesting, and it tends toward drawing other things into union with itself. This, I think, is again, let's go back to the form and matter relationship. Um, Insofar as the form of a thing bestows its actuality on matter, that matter is brought into a more unifying relationship with the form that it receives, because think about life, for example. Not only does like the body of an animal reflect its form,
Mm-hmm.
but but the more but the body is brought into union with its form by being alive, because the form in life is what we would call the soul. The soul is the form of the body, and insofar as the body has union with uh, the soul, that union is manifested through uh, animation, through the fact that the creature is alive. And I think so. So that's a way to establish that that unitive relationship between actuality and that which is actualized, right? And so that's kind of a way to establish it, through that prism. I'm trying to think of maybe another way to sort of another example to use, but ultimately, I think what you have is the reception of actuality in a thing brings the potentiality, the more actual that thing is, into a deeper and more intimate union with that actuality. So
Yeah.
the more perfect a thing is, the more it participates in the actuality that that thing receives. The more it participates in the goodness that that thing is received by that actuality. So, we could use the example of geometric figures again, right? A triangle being a more perfect triangle will participate more intimately, more fully
Mm-hmm.
in triangularity. And the more the more a thing is touched by the good, the more intimately it's drawn into the source of that goodness, which is that actuality of the thing in question. So that's manifestation and union established from the standpoint of the created perfections, the created participations in the good. I think we can also establish both of these by just thinking about what we know about God
Mm-hmm.
Himself. So let's go back to manifestation, right? How do we know that God, as goodness itself, is self-manifesting? Well, we know that we were created, right? If we establish the existence of God, we know that He created us,
Right. Mm-hmm.
and not just us as in human beings. I mean, just the fact of creation itself. We know that creation is a result of God's divine action. But what else do we know about God? We know that God is supremely simple. We know that He is altogether simple. We know that He is that there are no constitutive parts that make up the divine. So therefore, what we know from this is that God's action, even the creative action, is going to be a reflection or a manifestation of all that He is.
Mm-hmm.
Because if that weren't the case, then He would be drawing from some other motivation other than Himself, which is impossible given classical theism. So we know that His creation of the world has to be a manifestation of who He is, right? And that goes for the substance of the content of creation, that it reflects the divine, but also His desire to create. His act of creation reflects something about Himself, that He is self-manifesting,
Mm-hmm.
that self-manifestation signifies who God is in a very profound way. So this can begin to bleed into Trinitarian implications as well, right? Because if we know that God is within Himself self-manifesting, given the fact of creation, then, and we know that creation is not a necessary emanation from God, that God was not compelled to create, because that goes against what we know about God as fully perfect in Himself and not needing of anything outside of
Mm-hmm.
Himself, right? Because we know that creation was not necessary. We know that God is self-manifesting in Himself prior to all ages. We could use that creed, ante omnia saeculos,
Mm-hmm.
before the ages of ages. He is self-manifesting.
Right. Yeah.
We yeah, we
Yeah.
can
No,
talk a little bit about that.
yeah. I mean, we might as well just address that now, because one of the concerns, and it's a legitimate concern of this line of reasoning is, are we going to suffer a modal collapse, right? Are we going to be committed to
Right. Yeah.
necessary emanation? And there's many ways of dealing with this. I've had numerous videos and conversations about modal collapse. I've got an entire hour-and-a-half episode defending divine simplicity against modal collapse and contingent knowledge. So I'm not going to get into all of it again. In relation to this, though, I do want to bring up one consideration from Norris Clark.
Yeah.
Which has always struck me as really fascinating, because he actually kind of pushes back on St. Thomas a little bit, because St. Thomas kind of wants to, he wants to kind of mostly kind of talk about what we're talking about in terms of final rather than efficient causality to alleviate some of these concerns. And Norris Clark says, hey, maybe St. Thomas is right, but also maybe he's a little too quick, because the Trinity is a really cool feature here, and it seems itself to do a lot of work and be able to help with some concerns. One is that look, God does necessarily communicate himself, right, in his inner life, right? All Trinitarian, everybody who's committed to the Trinity, is committed to that, right? We do have this rich inner life of God, this inner knowing, loving, self-diffusive, self-communicating relationship, right? And what Clark wants to say is, not only does this fit really well with the metaphysical scheme that we've been talking about, but it also provides something of a stopgate, is how he talks about it, to a modal collapse, because the sort of the nature of the good is being self-communicative. It's a very self-communicative. That's a really tricky one to say. Is sort of like fully satisfied in God's inner life, fully and completely satisfied in that perfect inner life of Trinity. That God doesn't need, right, to satisfy his character or nature by going beyond that. But he clearly did, and in which case all of that is just pure gratuitous surplus. So there's just an interest. I just want to put out the interesting suggestion by Father Norris Clark, which I think has not received as much attention as it should, of how the Trinity itself can play a really kind of cool role in these types of considerations, like kind of dual roles, actually, for both showing that fits well with these the notions and of goodness that we've been talking about, but also can help to alleviate concerns of necessary emanation and stuff like that as well.
Yeah, because I mean, it's not to say that this principle establishes explicitly, paternity, spiration, generation,
relational opposition, and all that.
But what it does establish is that there should be within God an internal mechanism by which he is self-communicative in himself, prior to the ages of ages, prior to his free decision to create the world and manifest that inner fecund divine life outside of himself. That this if it's not fulfilled in himself prior to creation, well, then it really does start to seem like creation is this necessary overflow of divinity, that God is limited in some way, that he is compelled to overflow, right? And in order to fully guard against that, you need an internal divine mechanism whereby this self-communication, this divine self-communication can be fulfilled. And I think the Trinity, once it has been revealed to us, coheres with that. To use the word that you brought into the discussion, I think very wisely, it coheres best with that principle. So that's sort of an aside on the Trinity, because again, if we're talking about Christianity generally, Christianity has two main distinctive doctrines. It's not just the incarnation; it's also the Trinity.
That's right.
So I think what we have established that that the good as self-manifesting can be established both from creaturely goodness, but also from what we know about God. I also want to talk a little bit about how the good as tending toward union can also be established just by thinking about what we know about God. And that is the fact that God's, again, we have to start with the fact that we know that we were created by God. We know that we are a result of God's creative self-manifestation, right? What end other than himself could God really do anything? And the answer is none. So not only is God's inner self manifestation, not only is the end of his self manifestation himself, and that is to say, union with himself, we also have to be committed to saying that his decision to create the cosmos, the end for which he did that is himself, union with himself, right?
Right.
So, and if we know that God is the very essence of goodness itself, we know that this is a character of goodness as well. That goodness tends toward union.
Hmm.
And again, we see this in the natural world all the time. Um,
What do I want to do with my
uh,
my sweet little
you
baby
know,
Marin? I just want to eat her
again,
face, right? I just want to smush her up, right? Sorry,
yeah, I
you
mean,
go ahead.
exactly. Like, and you can also talk about,
I'm talking about babies
yeah,
being
yeah,
really
yeah.
cute. I'm talking about
Um,
babies being cute. If I wanted to get
to
that right.
use, yeah, in case anybody is socially challenged and doesn't understand. But no, the light, like to use maybe like Dionysian example again. Dionysius is obsessed with light, and it's a very common theme throughout
Hmm.
Greek fathers in particular, that they really like the light example, and for good reason, I think. Um, how light tends toward drawing other things towards its warmth. Um, so anything that is by nature good has a tendency to draw other things toward participation in itself.
Hmm.
Uh, I think we've done pretty well to establish both of those things, both from the standpoint of creation and from the standpoint of what we know about God.
Right.
So, to sum up a bit, we know that goodness itself has a tendency towards self-manifesting and a tendency toward drawing others into union with itself.
Yeah.
And so therefore we also know that God himself is self-manifesting in himself, and he also tends toward union within himself. And that these two dimensions of the good have to be brought out, reflected in creation. Uh, that's inescapable.
Hmm.
So now, what else did we say about classical theism at the beginning? Well, God is infinite. God is boundless. Uh, so when we think about God's relationship to the world, uh, we have to ask ourselves, well, what do you get when you add an infinite God, an infinite tendency towards self-manifestation reflected in creation, an infinite tendency to draw others into union with himself reflected in creation? How would these things come together in a way that befits that most uh, fully befits um, these three characteristics of the divine? Well, I think you would have this these divine qualities manifested in creation, not just manifested in creation, but in a full and complete way that, as much as possible, reflects that infinite fecundity of the divine that he has within himself. And when you think of what would this really look like, I think St. Thomas actually gives a very, very, very uh, short and uh, profoundly wise couple of sentences here to describe it. And, and I know that a lot of people can anticipate, well, why is he quoting St. Thomas? I'll get to that in a minute. What he says here is, uh, to each thing, and this is in his Tertia Parse
Hmm.
on the fitness of the incarnation. He says, to each thing that is befitting which belongs to it by reason of its very nature. Thus, to reason befits man, since this belongs to him because he is of a rational nature. But the very nature of God is goodness, as is clear from Dionysius. Hence, what belongs to the essence of goodness befits God. This is what we've been establishing, right? Um, but it belongs to the essence of goodness to communicate itself to others. This is plain from Dionysius. Hence, it belongs to the essence of the highest good to communicate itself in the highest manner to the creature. That is brought about chiefly by his so joining created nature to himself, that one person is made up of these three: the Word, a soul, and flesh, as Augustine says. Hence, it is manifest that it was fitting that God should become incarnate. So, what we have here, what would be the most befitting way for these truths to come together, would be a a a, a full and complete self outpouring of divinity into creation as such. Now,
Mm-hmm.
how do we get creation as such all together um, into this union? Well, what is humanity? Humanity encompasses the whole of creation. It's a minor mundi. It's
It's
a
the
little
hierarchy.
world.
Yeah, it's the hierarchy of being just smushed into one, right?
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. Because we have the vegetative. Well, actually, I should start. We have mineral life, or not life. We have mineral being as part of our physical constitution, and we have vegetative life. We have the sensuous life that's shared with the animals, and we have rational life shared with the angels, all in one substance. So humanity, and this is a theme that is picked up by uh, Maximus the Confessor as well. He's very big on this. You have it in Robert Grosseteste as well. You have it in Scotus. You have it in Aquinas here. Um, it's actually a very common theme uh, in Christian thought, and unfortunately, it hasn't got very much attention. I
Mhm.
don't think, uh, at least in popular apologetics, no one really brings this up, and I have no idea why. Um, uh, that that humanity is 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 this microcosm of all of creation.
Yeah, microcosm within the macrocosm, right on. Hmm.
Yes, absolutely. And so what you have here is what would be most fitting to bring all of these truths together would be the divine manifesting himself and drawing uh, toward union with himself, uh, outpouring that in a full and complete way in creation itself through a human nature. And so what you would have is this union of humanity and divinity coming together in a full and complete way to uh, to bring to uh, fruition uh, these truths about God in relationship to the world that we can already establish just by thinking about creation and thinking about the nature of God. So
Right.
I think the incarnation is something that really brings all of these truths uh, together in the most fitting way, right? Um, uh, Now, I know what a lot of people are going to say. They're going to say that, well, St. Thomas didn't think that. St. Thomas didn't was said that the incarnation would not have happened if man didn't sin.
Right. If the fall didn't happen, the incarnation wouldn't happen, right? Hmm.
Right, right, yeah. No fall, no incarnation. Like that's the. But I think there are a couple things to say about that. For one, we don't need St. Thomas for this to be true. I mean, uh, I think we could just say that there are enough doctors of the church. There are, we have Scotus, we have Maximus the Confessor, um, we have uh, we have Saint Albert the Great, a Dominican,
Hmm.
mind you, a Dominican,
Hmm.
who all believe that the incarnation would have happened even if man did not sin, right?
Right. Hmm.
Um, but I think there's, you know, I think a conclusion that you have to come to when reading these texts in Saint Thomas is that uh, I think the reason for his hesitancy principally has to do with authority.
Mhm.
I think he relies heavily on the authority of Augustine, who flatly said that the incarnation wouldn't have happened if man didn't sin. So I think he feels restricted by Augustine. I think he doesn't see a lot of evidence for it in Scripture, even though I think that's not really correct. I think you can make a very strong case that Colossians 1:15 is very bears witness to this truth. When St. Paul says he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things were created in heaven and earth, visible and invisible, and all things were created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together.
Mhm.
So this is sort of the biblical justification for this absolute predestination of Christ.
Yeah.
This absolute to really argue that Christ, that the incarnation, is the ultimate end for which the world is created in the first place.
Mhm.
That this coming together of this marriage of the cosmos and the divine is the purpose for which creation happened. And this coheres with what we've been establishing, right? That God is self-manifesting in himself, and he tends towards union within himself, and that uh, to manifest that in the fullest and most complete way possible,
Mhm.
which I think is befitting of the divine infinitude, right?
Yeah.
It's befitting of the divine majesty. Um, would fulfill itself perfectly in something very much like the incarnation, right? And to just give maybe another text of St. Thomas that leads me to think that this is the case, because I think there's a little bit of a contradiction here. This is his work before his third part of the Summa, so I think he changed his mind later to have the position that the incarnation would not have happened.
Yeah.
This is
Mhm.
what he says in his earlier writing. He says, and this is on speaking on the virtue of faith. He says, uh, therefore, belief of some kind in the mystery of Christ's incarnation was necessary at all times and for all persons, but this belief differed according to the differences of times and persons. The reason for this is that before the state of sin, man believed explicitly in Christ's incarnation, insofar as it was intended for the consummation of glory, but not insofar as it was intended to deliver man from sin by the passion and the resurrection, since man had no foreknowledge of his future sin. So he recognizes that the incarnation doesn't only serve this redemptive purpose,
Mhm.
it also serves this purpose of, what does he say, the consummation of glory. Well, this is precisely what we've been talking about, right? The consummation of this manifestation of God and this great marriage of the divine and the cosmos in Christ.
Right.
Um, so maybe we could pause a bit here and maybe recollect our thoughts a bit, because
Mhm.
this is the heart of the argument.
Yeah, no, and I'm with you. I know we were talking a little bit before, and I've been clear about this before. Is like, look, I love St. Thomas. I think he's a great guide on many things, both in the way he thinks, the manner, and the matter of the conclusions he reaches. But he's not an infallible guide. And if I need to part with St. Thomas, I'll part with St. Thomas. I've done it on other issues, or there's certain issues where I've said, where there's sort of interpretive issues where I'm very open, related to predestination actually, where I'm like, okay, like if this was the position that St. Thomas really took, then I'm going the other way, right? And it's just important to, I think, have the right posture to St. Thomas as Catholics who greatly esteem and admire him, rightfully so, right? The man was a genius, but at the end of the day, St. Thomas isn't, he isn't the sole ultimate authority here either, and it's okay, right? If you think you have good insights or reasons to maybe take a different position on some of these things, and I think it's actually some of the later Thomists that have done really good work on this, like Father Norris Clark, that have just brought me to the position that we're trying to outline here. And I also just say, like, this was something that was very attractive to me just independently before I really kind of like, it was influential in my own becoming Catholic as well, because you find these insights, of course, not just within but without the Christian tradition. And it sets up this rational expectation, this rational anticipation, and then you just kind of like see that on the scene, that it fits so well, and you're just like, oh yeah, of course, right? Like, yeah. And then like the fact that there's an historical case to be made for it as well is of course really important. But the fact that it's just there, um, this moment in history where Christianity just sort of exploded onto the scene with
Right,
these
exactly.
radical claims, it fits so well that at the very least it should just make everyone pause and just kind of scratch their head a little bit. You know what I mean?
And it's also important to recognize that, the apostles who died for this belief, they weren't dying for these philosophical abstractions. They were dying because they bore witness to something in
Right.
history.
Yeah, they weren't doing the weedy metaphysics that we are like, no,
No,
this has to be true given
like
these metaphysical convictions. No, they were there,
these were
they
not
witnessed it. Yeah.
Neoplatonists. These
Right. Yeah.
were
100%.
these were men who saw something.
Right. Very.
What does St. John say in a very explicit way? Who we have touched, who we have seen, uh, Christ, who we have seen, who we have touched. He's emphasizing the radical concreteness of the witness
Mm-hmm.
of what he saw, of what was seen, what was touched, what was experienced.
Yeah.
And that's why they went to their death. They weren't doing this abstract metaphysics. It's so what we have. So what we have, just maybe step back a bit,
Yeah. When we
is we
summarize and
have this
recollect.
rational, yeah. We have this rational expectation that I think you can derive that from the arguments that we've been giving, that um, that it's most rationally plausible, most fitting that there would be this unification of the microcosm of creation with the divine himself.
Mm-hmm.
That this would be that this would happen. That we can
It
expect
makes
this.
good sense, right? Mm-hmm.
Yes, and then you look into history, and you see this explosive movement born out of witness,
Mm-hmm.
not out of abstract metaphysics, born out of witness, uh, but nevertheless predicated precisely on these claims, these claims that not only that God is self-manifesting and unitive within himself in the triune life of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but also that he has entered into creation in such a radically unified manner, such that it's one person in two natures.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this isn't just a very close relationship. This is the hypostatic union we're talking about,
Right. Mm-hmm.
right? And these two doctrines, I think, really do fulfill what can be expected by reason. And I'll go a bit further than this, even. We can also understand, even without divine revelation, that we as individual human beings have this yearning for God. And we are endowed with intellect and will, and as such, we have God as our last end. We want to know the first cause, and we want to have union with the first cause of all things. That can be established by reason, I think. But we also know that our ordinary manner of behavior, our ordinary manner of existence, radically pulls us away from that. And we know that we know we have no means of attaining that final end. If you want proof of this, try to think of what God's essence is. Go ahead, try. You
Mm-hmm.
can't do it. You can't do it. There's no way to do it on our own. We know that. That's obvious.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to get there by just philosophically contemplating the first cause, and you're not going to get there through Neoplatonic theurgic magic. Okay,
Right
that's
on.
not going to get you there either. The way of that's just, there's no way to to bring about the beatific vision in ourselves. We cannot conjure that up within ourselves. In fact, the opposite is true. We are we are always drawn to our passions. We're always drawn to irrational behavior. We're always drawn to behavior that draws us away from the good. So we know that. So given that fact of our experience of human brokenness, um, would it not be fitting that as part of God's self-manifestation in the world, as part of God's coming together of humanity and divinity, uh, to bring us, who are participants in this human nature that He created for this ultimate, for the purpose of ultimate glory, would it not be fitting for Him to use this means as a way to bring us out of this state,
Mhm.
and to participate in Him in this body mystically? I think everybody understands where I'm getting, where I'm going. That this that the Catholicism in particular, Christianity generally also has this concept of the mystical body, right? But Catholicism really, really hinges on this that incorporation into Christ is being united in His mystical body, so that the church, the sacramental life of the church in particular, is that incarnation in history.
Right.
Uh,
Mhm.
it is that incarnation, uh, made present to us.
Mhm.
That those two characteristics, manifestation and union, proceed out of the incarnate God through the sacraments of the church,
Yeah, and I
through
wanna I wanna
the
highlight
church
that.
herself.
Yeah, CT, because this is something that really has always struck me. It still strikes me and made me very much inclined to the Catholic paradigm. Is the theme of this conversation is coherence and befittingness. And
Yes.
what is the Catholic Church? Well, it's extremely befitting of human nature, right? That if God is going to pull us into union with Himself, He's going to do it in a way that befits the mode of being of the creatures in consideration, right? And what are we? Well, we're rational animals, yeah, but we're also rational social animals. We're rational social physical animals. We're rational
Yep.
social physical dependent animals that depend on tradition and authority for many things, that are inclined towards hierarchy and institutionality, right? So all of
Yep.
this is just so utterly befitting, and to me just shows a great understanding of human nature, which of course God would have, that again are just like, are they deductive proofs? No, but for me there was just weight in the scale, weight in the scale, weight in the scale, weight in the
Exactly.
scale. You see what I mean? Hmm.
Exactly. And I think that's very important to underscore that, yes, we are not, these are not deductive proofs. People might say, oh, well, you're making leaps and bounds. You're not uh, uh, connecting everything together by absolute deductive proofs. That was never the intention. That was never the intention. The intention was to articulate the coherence of Christianity with what we know from metaphysical commitments that are demonstrable, that are
Hmm.
deductively certain,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
And I think, and I hope that this stream has done that. If there's parts of it that were confusing, maybe watch it again.
Yeah, and we have
Uh,
many other videos on some of these things, but to summarize, like, let me just try and give the 10,000-foot view of what we've
yeah,
talked
please
about,
do,
and
please
then
do.
you do, right? Is that given either very plausible assumptions about classical theism, or even just entailments of classical theism, about the nature of God, about the nature of goodness, right? What we can say is that something like, and I say something like just to be modest, right? But something like the incarnation is predictable or to be anticipated, is really befitting, makes sense. And given that we have a hypothesis that makes a particular sort of prediction, if we then see a data point that seems to fit that right mold, what that does is that counts really strongly in favor of that hypothesis. And I love what you said at the beginning, is this helps to sort of share the epistemic burden, right? If we already have prior independent philosophical, metaphysical considerations to think that something like the incarnation would occur, and then we have, let's just say decent, I think it's much better than decent, but decent historical evidence that the incarnation did occur, was attested by people who were willing to
Right.
die for it, right?
And who weren't thinking about these things.
And who weren't doing the abstract metaphysics. It's got to make you just like go, yeah, not a deductive proof, but it's got to just make you go, I should look into that, right?
It's it's
That
kind of
seems
like
really interesting,
it's kind of
right?
like what Gavin curses, and I don't mean to drag him into this because I know he doesn't necessarily
It's all
accept
right.
this
He can
thesis.
he can take it.
But what he said, I know one thing he said about Exodus 3:14, about the revelation of God to Moses through the burning bush. You know, I am that am, right? Um, that this points to the most profound truths that you get from St. Thomas's existential metaphysics. And we know that Moses, although Moses was not just some. I mean, Moses had profound insights in philosophy and philosophical thought. Don't get me wrong, but I do think that that there's a similar thing going on here, right? Where I don't think Moses was necessarily speculating about existential metaphysics, and because of that, he wrote this tale about the burning bush. Okay.
Right.
Similarly, I think even more so with the apostles, who we know were not philosophers, right? We know that about them. We know that they were humble fishermen. That they go to their deaths, or at least that is historically plausible. If we're thinking outside the framework of revealed theology, that it's historically plausible that they went to their deaths based on this historical witness, not on abstract metaphysics. That the fact that it does cohere very well and very nicely with these metaphysical commitments, these philosophical speculations, that there you have the epistemic symbiosis that I was kind of talking about.
Yeah. Beautiful, man. I could jam on this all day, and we'll have to set up like a part 2 and a Q&A, because I do have to jet here in a few minutes. But before we do, CT, give us kind of your, I guess, any additional final thoughts that you have, and then also make sure that you tell people about your very good YouTube channel, and maybe mention some of the videos that are just that go a little bit deeper or support some of the themes that we've talked about in this episode.
Yeah. So I actually think you summarized it way better than I could have to just close it off. I think what you said was perfect. What I will say, to get into further information that I've done on my channel, I have the video An Argument for Christianity, where I develop these metaphysical commitments about the good as self-diffusive, and about how we know that God is goodness itself and such. I go into that in much more detail in that video, An Argument for Christianity. I also have a video about how the Trinity saves us from pantheism, so that establishes more like the Trinitarian dimensions of what we've been talking about. I plan to make more on this subject too, maybe even with you, now that I know how closely united we are in this in this idea in particular. I didn't know that. I mean, I didn't know how you came to these conclusions parallel with my own thinking.
Yeah, and the short of it for me is the Thomistic personalists were deeply influential to me.
So you can check out my YouTube channel. It's Classical Theist. If you want to follow me on Twitter, you can go ahead. My Telegram is t.me/classicaltheist. But it's really been an honor and a pleasure to be with you again, and hopefully we can discuss this more in the future.
Yeah, likewise, CT. I'd love to do another extended episode, maybe me, you, Gavin, and I know there's always lots of great questions and comments, so maybe we could just do a general Q&A one at some point here in the future. I think that'd be a lot of fun. But in the meantime, gentle listeners, thanks for tuning in. Please do like, comment, share, subscribe, and we'll catch you on the next episode. Adios.